Joining me on the program is author Julian Cribb. He's authored a new book called The Coming Famine, the Global Food Crisis, and What We Can Do to Avoid It. Julian, your book, I almost look as a wake-up call. It deals with probably one of the most urgent issues of 21st century, which is food, whether we can sustain our food supply through mid-century, and more importantly, what are the likely consequences of our failure to do so? What brought this to your attention, and what caused you to write this book?
Well, I've been following agriculture as a journalist, newspaper editor for many, many years, Jim, and I was getting increasingly concerned that governments in particular were not understanding what was going on in agriculture worldwide, that farmers were losing their land and their water to the cities and to climate change, that fertilizer and oil are both finite resources and we're going to run out of them sooner or later, or they'll get very, very expensive, that we haven't been investing in science and technology for food production in any serious way for about 20 or 30 years. We've become very, very complacent. Because we've got so much food in the Western world, we've assumed it's okay, but it's not. The world food situation is becoming increasingly perilous, and as we run into various shortages or droughts and things like that, there will be big impacts which everyone is going to feel.
You know, Julian, others before you have voiced similar concerns that we've seen matters raised on issues not only of food, water, energy, trade. Unfortunately, a lot of these voices have not been heeded as they should have been. So, in your book, who are you trying to address in your book? What audience are you trying to reach?
Well, I'm primarily trying to reach those who eat. In other words, all human beings. This is something that we should all be concerned about, no matter where we live, what society we live in, what our level of wealth or living standards are. We've all got to eat. We can't do without it. And governments have really forgotten about food as a primary issue. I mean, it is the one thing that enables you to build a stable society. If you don't have food, governments get torn down. We saw that in the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution. We saw that in the wars in Africa, in Darfur and Rwanda. I mean, they're all agricultural disputes at bottom. So if you want to build a civil society and stable government and have education and clean water and all those things that we take for granted in the West, you need to have a reliable supply of food first. And that is not what is happening at the moment. People have forgotten about how important food is as a foundation for stability and peace.
Let's talk about a meeting that took place in the summer of 2008 in Japan with meeting of our G8 leaders when the subject of food shortages was first approached. Let's begin with that story.
Yeah, well, the G8 are the 8 most powerful men and women on the planet, and they were having a marvelous feast in Japan at a cost of some $500 million US, and basically they were discussing why food prices were going through the roof, particularly in the third world, but also in the Western world. I mean, there was a rice crisis on, with rice prices soaring and countries banning exports and things like that. There were food riots in 30 or 40 odd countries. Even in places like the United States and Britain, rice was being taken off supermarket shelves and rationed to consumers. And it had all come out of nowhere. They were shocked. They thought that food was a problem that had been solved. And suddenly it was revealed to them that it had not been solved, that the world is still a food insecure place. And, candidly, they were taken by surprise, and they were annoyed about it, as politicians often are. And they were calling for action, but there really hasn't been much action.
You know, we're not, Julian, at least at this point, at a crisis state today. The coming famine that you're writing about hasn't arrived. So what outside the spot food shortages that we saw between 2007 and 2008, most people, I would say, are unaware what has happened to our food stocks, or how, for example, between the years 2001 and 2008, the world steadily consumed more grain than it produced, triggering the rising prices that we've seen in this decade.
Yeah, it was that failure to invest in agriculture worldwide that led to dwindling grain stocks. And then that brought in the speculators and, the commodity prices soared and things like that. That was the first of the shocks. There was another little shock this year when corn prices in the US went through the roof, actually the fastest rise in corn prices for 40 years, due to a drought in Russia. Now, why would a drought in Russia affect corn prices in America? The answer is the whole world is now joined together economically in terms of its food prices. And if there is a food crisis somewhere, it affects everybody very, very quickly. The shockwaves travel right through the world economy in a matter of hours or days, and consumers in supermarkets in food-sufficient Western countries, they start to feel it as well. Now, what I'm looking at is the time ahead when there are basically 9, 10 or even 11 billion human beings on the planet, all wanting to eat protein like we do in the United States and Australia and Europe, and that is going to require a doubling in the food supply. However, we're running out of fresh water because the cities are taking it away from the farmers, and climate is stealing it from the grain belt. We're running out of land because, again, the cities are taking over land from farmers, or miners are taking land, or it's being degraded and eroded. We're losing 1% of the world's farmland every single year at the current rates, and we have done for a quarter of a century. Now, if we keep on doing that, we're going to halve the amount of land on which we have to double food production, and that's just not doable, really. And at the same time, as I mentioned, oil and fertilizer are both finite mineral resources, and they're going to become scarce and very, very expensive at some point in the future. So we need to start planning now what we're going to do when the oil becomes too pricey for farmers to use in their tractors, or the fertilizer becomes too pricey for them to afford, because both of those things will hit the world food supply very hard indeed. And in fact, the 2008 crisis was largely prompted by oil going to $160 a barrel. So that was one of the things that drove the very high prices of rice and other grains. So all these things are connected together, and this is the bit that people haven't really understood, that there are these 7 immense forces bearing down on agriculture, and they're all acting in sync with one another. And that includes climate change, and it includes the oceans gradually running out of fish. We're not going to be able to double the food supply from the oceans. So all of these things are starting to interact, and that is the concern, that people haven't seen this. They've tended to regard it as one problem or another, an energy problem or a water problem or something like that. It's not. It's 7 big problems all acting to constrain the world food production.
Yeah, that brings me to my next question, because I've read in the papers and also talked to other people that attribute the food crisis. It's been blamed on, for example, growth in human population. We've grown from 3 billion people on the planet in 1960 to 6.8 billion by the year 2008. Others attribute it to prosperity as, let's say, Asia becomes more prosperous, India becomes more prosperous, people change their diets, they eat more protein. Some have blamed it on weather. Others, as you just recently said, a lack of investment. We've had climate crisis and food crisis are both interlinked. So as you view the problem, it is really more a result of a confluence of many of these large and what are intractable causes that tend to, I guess in one sense, don't they amplify one another?
Yes, they do indeed. The climate crisis, for example, amplifies all the way through agriculture, and so does the oil prices. I mean, our agriculture is incredibly energy dependent, and now we've passed peak oil according to the International Energy Agency, and this means that farmers' fuel costs are only going to get more expensive. And if they take land out of food production in order to grow fuel, that's going to drive up the price of food. So, all of these issues are interlinked. The image I like for this is the Indian story of the blind men feeling the elephant, and they feel the legs and the trunk and the tail, and they all say, oh, it's something else. It's a tree, or it's a snake, or something like that. They're not seeing the whole picture. There is an elephant going on here, and it is comprised of these enormous forces: population growth, economic growth, and these huge constraints of water, energy, fertilizers, research, climate change, and those things, all interacting. And that's what makes it a particularly difficult problem, almost a wicked problem, to solve.
As you look at this problem, you have a chapter, What Food Crisis, and you break the problem into demand drivers such as population, consumer demand, but then also you talk about some of the supply constraints, for example, the water crisis that we're seeing break out around the globe, land scarcity, the loss of nutrients in the soil. You mentioned peak oil, oceans where we're overfishing many areas of the world, technology and climate. So when you take a look at all of these, let's talk about both, because we continue to add more people on the planet. More people means more food, more hungry mouths to feed. And yet, are we constrained to some extent on our ability to supply that food?
Well, I think that there is a complacent assumption that we can fix the problem just with technology, the way we did in the 1970s, that all we need is another green revolution. I'm saying that because of the confluence of these constraints or scarcities, we're not going to be able to fix it with just technology. We're also going to have to moderate our demand for food. People are going to have to eat at a lower level, at a level that doesn't cost, the landscape in order to produce the food. We're going to have to farm much more sensitively than we ever have in the past, even though we're aware in America and Australia and elsewhere of the importance of farming sustainably. We're going to have to farm even more sustainably in future. And we're going to have to use alternative forms of energy, because the oil will not be there to power the tractors or the pumps or the trucks to move things back and forth. And I think the issue that we really have sort of forgotten is the way these huge cities are growing. Now, by 2050, the footprint of the world's cities, all added together, will equal the land mass of the United States of America. That's all built up and covered in asphalt and concrete and car parks and what have you. That's all prime agricultural land that has been taken away from farming and will never, ever be returned to it. So that is one of the major issues. And the cities are taking water. They're draining the great river basins, so the farmers don't have the water to grow the food that they once had. And also, the cities are taking all the nutrients that come into them. They're throwing half the food in the garbage, and then they're sending all of their waste products either to landfill or out to the ocean, where they're lost. So we're hemorrhaging nutrients all along the chain here. We're just throwing away these precious things that actually keep us alive. And we need to rethink. We need to rethink our cities so that they cease to do this terrible waste. And I suppose the other dimension of this is that you mentioned that in some parts of the world people are very hungry. There's 1 billion hungry people in the world, but there's also nearly 1.5 billion obese people in the world. And they're the people who are overeating. Well, right now, about half of all people in the United States and in Europe and Australia and elsewhere die as a result of what they eat. They die from one or other of the degenerative diseases that are diet-related: cancer, heart disease, diabetes, and so on. And if we ate more healthily, we would not only live longer, and we would cost our governments a great deal less, but we would also tread less heavily on the planet. We would put less pressure on the agricultural landscapes. And so that would actually benefit agriculture as well.
You know, as you look around the globe, and Michael Clark in his book Resource Wars talked about this, but there are a number of conflicts around the globe where food shortages are linked directly to war. You show in your book a map of the globe showing that relationship between food insecurity and armed conflict. In fact, a lot of our listeners that may be listening to this interview remember the movie Black Hawk Down, where the UN and the U.S. was trying to distribute food in Somalia, and that was part of that movie. But there's a number of countries around the globe with food crises caused by war and conflict, and all of these conflicts have increased since 1980. In fact, you cite in your book the CIA's World Fact Book, which lists territorial disputes that have been brought on by resource competition. So this is a much more serious issue other than just the fact that people are starving, but it's also a major source of conflict.
Absolutely. I mean, I think military planners know this quite well, and you're seeing that in Washington and in Britain and in Scandinavia and so on. The defense think tanks are well aware that a food crisis can promote a war or an insurgency or something like that, and that war can then suck in other countries. So you end up with your children going in harm's way in someone else's country. But I think governments have actually not understood this, that underneath a lot of these conflicts, the original dispute was over food, land, and water. Whatever caused the two warring factions to break out into conflict, very often it's an argument over food, land, and water. And if you can just fix that problem, you can increase the chances of peace. That was a point made by Jimmy Carter. He's both a farmer, of course, and a statesman, and he understood this very well, that if people are well-fed, then they don't have so many wars. It's in the hungry countries where you see the most conflict. And in the world of the 21st century, we've got to worry not just about war, but also about the potential unleashing of tens or even hundreds of millions of refugees. I mean, if, for example, the water supply in the Indo-Gangetic Plains fails due to the melting of the Himalaya glaciers, and the harvests there halve, then you may well see 200 or 300 million people precipitated onto the world, refugees desperately trying to find another home where they can feed themselves. They'll go in all directions, and they will impact on all countries. So we need to be aware that if we are to avoid those sorts of crises, we need to shore up food security in these insecure regions, like the Indo-Gangetic Plain, or the North China Plain, or North Africa, or the Middle